Joining us now from California is Dr. Rania Awad. She is a clinical associate professor of psychiatry at Stanford University's School of Medicine. Dr. Rania, thank you very much for joining us here on our coverage. I tried to state this. I mean, the trauma of these survivors runs deep, and it runs across multiple levels. That is a fact. Let me begin by asking you what you think some of the immediate needs are.
Absolutely, and thank you for having me here tonight. Absolutely, we would say that this particular natural disaster is more than just a natural disaster, more than just an earthquake. We know that over 80% of the victims have been internally displaced or multiple times displaced. What we're dealing with is actually complex trauma. It is trauma in which it's layers upon layers of trauma. And so, therefore, the ability to regain one's sense of safety in the world again will definitely take much longer than a typical natural disaster or earthquake in this particular case.
When you're talking about this term complex trauma and it requiring a lot of effort for people to regain their safety, and this being a very difficult task, children come to mind. I mean, we have seen many of them orphaned, but not necessarily so. But they have specific needs when it comes to dealing with a trauma of this magnitude.
Correct, absolutely. With children, are concerned even more so. In many cases, as you can understand, that so many of the children have been born in a context of civil war. They have really not known full stability in all of the years of their life, and now add to it this particular series of earthquakes. And so we really worry about the stages of development. We're concerned about the very young children, the 3 to 6 year olds, the very young children who can't really verbalize fully what exactly they're experiencing. Their forms of trauma may actually show in things like regression, inability to sleep or really eat or speak, verbalize what it is they're having that's going on with them at the time. The children who are slightly older than them, maybe the 7 to 12-year-old age group, in this age group, they may be able to start to vocalize what is happening with them. But here too, we see signs of distress and regression that are what we would call nonverbal cues, in which we have to tune in and kind of see how exactly they're actually dealing with this. And your children who are now teenagers, adolescents, they too have full understanding of what's happening, but it's limited also in really being able to fully comprehend the magnitude of what this means for their life going forward. So at every stage of child's development, there is a different kind of processing that happens and a different kind of care and concern in terms of how to help them heal in the next stages going forward.
For adults, there is a set of unique unique problems. And coming back to this theme of this trauma being so complex, right now they're dealing with the immediate aftermath. But in the medium to longer term, you have to deal with housing issues because of this the instantaneous displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, a lack of employment, a lack of education for people in that age group. So this is something that needs to be dealt on multiple levels.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I would say oftentimes in relief work, what happens is, and understandably so, the focus is on food, clothing, shelter, necessities of basic livelihood. I would add to that, and as many of us in the mental health field would add, a fourth component to that really is mental health. Because we find that as we're able to give survivors of such tragedies food, clothing, and shelter, if the mental health aspect isn't dealt with, if the trauma isn't addressed and processed, if the grief isn't fully processed, the ability to get back on one's feet, even with food, clothing, and shelter in place, is actually a perpetual cycle that then doesn't really quite end and it prolongs itself if it's not dealt with sooner rather than later. So I would actually say that mental health should be one of the basic necessities. These are invisible wounds that are not seen quite as readily as some of the other aspects.
I want to talk to you about the situation just south of the border, that of Syria. We perhaps need to sort of shine some light in terms of the editorial coverage of our channel, obviously, because we are a network based in Turkey. The stories coming out from here are more important, but the situation in Syria is just as dire. In fact, even more so. This is a country that is already been ravaged by an internal conflict for more than a decade. A large portion of the population was already suffering from that as well. So that is a completely different set of problems, as I said in my previous question.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. And this is where we would see the earlier term I used of complex trauma here too is very much the case. In fact, I would also add that there is a series of different types of psychological consequences that may happen, and the sense of lack of safety and a sense of lack of stability and belonging is something that very much has long reaching impacts into the future. So, as you said, those who have been, whether they're children born in that decade of life going forward, or whether they are the adults trying to finally find placement. Some of the people that we have worked with here have told us family members of theirs from Syria have been displaced over 20 times. This earthquake would have been the 20th displacement, for example. So if you can imagine psychologically what that means, the impact for somebody going forward, the ability to really regain safety and stability will probably take just as long.
Okay. Dr. Rania Awad, thank you very much for joining us here on TRT World.